Welcome to Swadharma IAS Academy. Today we are tackling a massive, historic update for the Indian economy.
And if you are tuning in right now, we know exactly who you are. You are a serious civil services aspirant.
Yeah, whether you are preparing for UPSC, TGPSC, or APPSC.
Exactly. Keeping your finger on the pulse of the macroeconomic landscape is an absolutely non-negotiable part of your preparation.
It really is. And the update we are unpacking for you today is, well, it's not just a minor footnote to skim in a monthly current affairs magazine. It is a monumental structural shift.
We are talking about the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation.
MoSPI, right?
Right, MoSPI. They have announced a comprehensive revision of India's base years. We are talking about the foundational metrics of our entire economy.
The gross domestic product, the index of industrial production, and the consumer price index.
This is the kind of overhaul that fundamentally alters the lens through which we, and honestly the rest of the world, view the entire Indian growth story.
Because for the last several years, the narrative of our economic expansion, our per capita income, our fiscal deficits, literally everything has been measured against a yardstick forged in the financial year 2011-12.
Which is practically ancient history in economic terms.
It really is. And that brings up a fascinating piece of recent news that I think we need to clarify for everyone listening right out of the gate. Because it's incredibly easy to misinterpret, especially if you get asked about it in an interview setting.
Oh, you mean the IMF grade?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
You might have seen these sensational headlines recently about the International Monetary Fund giving India's GDP calculation a C grade.
Which immediately sounds terrible.
Right. The immediate instinct for an untrained reader is to assume the government is, cooking the books or putting out fraudulent data.
But as an aspirant, you have to look past the clickbait. The IMF was not alleging malicious manipulation.
Not at all.
The critique was entirely methodological. The IMF was basically pointing out that our statistical engine was running on an operating system from over a decade ago.
Right. We were attempting to quantify the immense complexities of a modern, digital-first, deeply financialized economy using an engine built in 2011-12.
The data wasn't intentionally misleading. It was simply failing to capture the full picture of the structural transformation the country has undergone.
And now, finally, that outdated engine is being swapped out.
It is. And our mission for this deep dive is to ensure that when you walk into the mains examination hall or when you sit before the interview panel, you don't just mechanically recite the new base year numbers.
Anyone can memorize the years?
Exactly. You need to demonstrate a profound understanding of the structural mechanics behind this new India economy.
So to do that, we really have to start at the absolute foundation. Back to basics. Let's unpack GDP, nominal versus real, and what a base year actually does.
Oh, good.
We all memorize that standard textbook definition of GDP for the mains, the total market value of all final goods and services produced within the domestic territory of a country in a given financial year.
Every single word in that definition carries weight.
It does. But where students usually trip up in applied economics is that specific phrase, market value.
Because inflation completely ruins the math.
Yes. It creates a statistical illusion. Market value is dictated by prices, and prices are inherently unstable.
Which brings us to the indispensable distinction between nominal GDP and real GDP. This is the bedrock of national accounting.
Let's ground this in a really tangible scenario. Forget the abstract textbook stuff. Let's use the chocolate analogy.
I like the chocolate analogy.
Right. So imagine the entire Indian economy just produces one thing, chocolates. Let's say we produce exactly 10 chocolates today in the current financial year, and the current prevailing market price of each chocolate is 10.
Okay, so if we calculate the total market value 10 chocolates multiplied by 10 each, we get a nominal GDP of 100.
Exactly. That figure is calculated using current prices. Nominal GDP is 100.
But consider the analytical dilemma here. What if we want to know if we actually produced more chocolates compared to a decade ago?
Let's say 10 years ago, we also produced exactly 10 chocolates. But back then, the cost of cocoa was lower, sugar was cheaper, and the market price of a chocolate was only 5.
So a decade ago, the nominal GDP would have been 10 chocolates multiplied by euro. That's 50.
So if a policymaker only looks at nominal GDP, it looks like our chocolate economy has experienced a massive boom. It doubled from 50 to 100.
The headlines would scream about 100% growth.
But the physical reality on the factory floor tells a completely different story. We didn't produce a single extra chocolate. The actual output, the tangible wealth created, remained completely stagnant at 10 units,
The only thing that expanded was the price tag,
driven entirely by inflation.
which demonstrates perfectly why nominal GDP is a highly flawed metric for tracking actual human progress or economic expansion. If you want to measure the true trajectory of our productive capacity, you must freeze the price variables.
You have to strip away the distorting veil of inflation.
Exactly. You have to revert to that older price of 5. You take today's stagnant production of 10 chocolates, multiply it by the frozen historical price of 5, and you get 50.
And that 50 is our real GDP. It isolates actual production from mere inflation.
And to freeze that price, you require a fixed reference point in time, a base year.
Let's use an analogy that our listeners will definitely relate to, student Mark.
Oh, this is a great way to reinforce it. Imagine I present you with 2 candidates. Student A scored 200 marks on their exam, and student B scored 300 marks. If I ask you who did better, your superficial analysis might be student B.
But I would immediately push back on that because I don't know the denominator.
Exactly, you don't have the reference point. What if student A scored 200 out of a maximum of 250 marks? That's an 80% success rate.
While student B scored 300 out of a maximum of 1,000 marks, that's only a 30% success rate.
The entire narrative flips. Student A is vastly superior. But you were only able to deduce the truth because I provided the total possible marks, the reference point.
In macroeconomics, the base year is that indispensable reference point. It is the specific chosen year whose prices we lock into place so we can accurately benchmark the real growth of our economy across decades.
And until this recent MoSPI announcement, our national reference point was the financial year 2011-12.
Let's really think about the profound implications of using a 2011-12 yardstick to measure the Indian economy of today. It's actually kind of absurd when you look at the technological leaps we've made.
The landscape is completely unrecognizable. Think about it. In 2011, the Unified Payments Interface UPI was not even a concept.
The idea that a daily wage earner or a street hawker could instantly receive digital payments via a QR code scan was science fiction.
The foundational pillars of our digital public infrastructure simply did not exist.
You didn't have the massive telecommunications disruption brought about by Geo in 2016, which democratized cheap data. There was no Swiggy, no Zomato.
The concept of quick commerce having groceries delivered in 10 minutes by a gig worker was unimaginable.
And the massive gig economy itself. The creator economy, the widespread adoption of OTT platforms as primary sources of household entertainment. None of this registered as statistically significant consumption back in 2011.
So if we are tasked with measuring the value of a hyper-connected, digital-first economy, using the economic weights of a pre-smartphone era is a recipe for massive data distortion.
Fast-growing modern sectors inherently end up being drastically undervalued.
Conversely, traditional sectors end up being artificially overrepresented, simply because they held dominant weightage back in 2011.
This transitions us perfectly into Module 2. A vital area for any UPSC aspirant, the historical timeline. Providing historical context is what separates a basic answer from a top-tier essay.
The practice of establishing a base year didn't start recently. It began almost immediately after independence.
The first ever national income estimates for a free India were published with the base year of 1948-49.
And this monumental statistical endeavor was spearheaded by the National Income Committee. For those taking detailed notes, remember the chairperson of that committee.
P.C. Mahalanobis.
Yes. His name is permanently etched into the architectural framework of Indian economic planning.
So 1948-49 was the starting line. And the revision we are dissecting today, the shift to 2022-23, marks the 8th major revision of its kind in our nation's history.
Historically, the base year was revised roughly once every 10 years. But as we moved past the economic liberalization of 1991, the pace of economic change accelerated dramatically.
So the government recognized the need to shift toward a 5-year revision cycle.
Right, which brings up the last massive revision we experienced, which took place in 2015. We shifted the base year from 2004-05 to 2011-12.
But as any serious student of economics knows, that wasn't just a simple calendar update. It was accompanied by a massive methodological earthquake.
It really was a watershed moment. In 2015, India aligned its national accounting practices with global best practices, specifically adopting the United Nations System of National Accounts, known as S&A 2008.
And the most significant change there was the shift in how we report our headline GDP.
Prior to 2015, India primarily calculated and reported its headline growth at factor cost.
Let's break down factor cost for the listener because it is a foundational concept.
Yeah.
Factor cost is essentially the core cost of production.
It represents the payments made to all the factors of production.
The rent for land, the wages for labor, the interest for capital, and the profit for entrepreneurship.
It is the cost calculated right at the factory gate before the government intervenes with any taxes or subsidies.
But the UN S&A 2008 framework recommended that headline GDP should reflect what the consumer actually pays.
Like a means measuring GDP at market price.
And to bridge the gap from factor cost to market price, you have to account for government intervention. Specifically, you add net indirect taxes.
You take the base factor cost, add the indirect taxes levied by the government like GST today, and then you subtract any subsidies the government provides.
So since that 2015 revision, whenever you see a headline stating India's GDP grew by 7 or 8%, you are looking at GDP at market price.
But here is the obvious chronological discrepancy that an examiner might ask about.
Right. If the post-1990 philosophy was to update the base year every 5 years, and the last update anchored us to 2011-12, why are we only just now getting a new base year?
What exactly happened to the missing decade?
It is a compelling narrative of compounded macroeconomic shocks. The Ministry of Statistics didn't just forget. They actively initiated the complex process of shifting the base year to 2017-18.
But let's pause and think about what the Indian economy was actually experiencing around 2017 and 2018. A base year, by its very definition, must be a stable year.
You require a period with minimal economic volatility. If you choose a volatile year, you bake those anomalies into your economic measurements for the next decade.
And the period encompassing 2017-18 was the absolute antithesis of stable.
You had a series of unprecedented policy shocks. First, in November 2016, you had demonetization.
This sent massive disruptive shockwaves through the cash-reliant informal economy.
It wiped out liquidity and froze supply chains for millions of unorganized enterprises.
Then, while the economy was still absorbing that shock, July 2017 saw the historic rollout of the goods and services tax.
The GST completely overhauled the indirect tax regime. It dismantled state borders for trade, but it caused massive transitional friction and compliance bottlenecks for businesses.
Those twin policy disruptions were enough to disqualify the period, but the government also faced severe challenges regarding the integrity of the data collected during that time.
Right. The Periodic Labor Force Survey, the PLFS, yielded data that many felt did not accurately capture the transitional employment dynamics.
And more critically, the results from the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, the absolute cornerstone data required for setting a base year, were ultimately scrapped.
There were severe data quality concerns. You had a potent combination of intense structural disruption and unreliable statistical feedback. Utilizing 2017-18 would have been a catastrophic methodological error.
So MoSPI wisely scrapped the 2017-18 plan. They went back to the drawing board, hoping for a period of stabilization.
And the
pandemic hit.
Right. COVID-19 paralyzed the globe in early 2020. You obviously cannot utilize a pandemic year, characterized by absolute national lockdowns and shattered supply chains, as a stable reference point.
The volatility was historically unprecedented.
Which brings us to the present moment and the selection of 2022-23. Why is this specific year the perfect anchor?
Because it satisfies all the rigorous criteria for a robust base year. Foremost, by 2022-23, the Indian economy had largely recovered from the extreme disruptions of the pandemic.
The macroeconomic environment returned to a state of relative equilibrium.
And crucially, excellent data was finally available. The Household Consumption Expenditure Survey was successfully executed and validated.
It's important to note that this massive shift was guided by a 26-member committee under Biswanath Goldar. Dropping that name in a mains essay shows you understand the institutional mechanics.
Exactly. It shows depth.
Let's shift our focus to Module 3, the star of the show when it comes to structural analysis, GDP versus GVA.
Yes. Whenever quarterly growth numbers drop, the mainstream media universally fixates on the GDP figure.
But serious economists and top-tier candidates immediately look past the headline and dig into the GVA numbers. Let's thoroughly demystify gross value added.
As we defined earlier, GDP measures the economy from the perspective of the consumer, or the demand side. It captures the final market price paid, which inherently includes taxes and subtracts subsidies.
Let's use a hypothetical to show why that's an issue for structural analysis. Imagine the government is facing a revenue shortfall and suddenly decides to drastically increase the GST on all passenger vehicles from 28% to 40%.
The market price of every car shoots up.
Consequently, the total market value of cars sold increases, and therefore the overall GDP number artificially inflates.
But look at the reality. Did the automotive sector actually innovate?
No.
Did they manufacture better engines?
No. The GDP spiked solely because the government altered its fiscal tax policy.
That perfectly illustrates the limitation of GDP as a standalone metric for industrial health. It is contaminated by tax policy.
And that is precisely why we rely on gross value added, or GVA.
While GDP views the economy from the demand side, GVA views it entirely from the producer's perspective, the supply side.
GVA offers a clean, sector-specific picture of growth. It measures the total value of goods and services produced, but it meticulously strips away the impact of taxes and subsidies.
It isolates the actual tangible value added by the labor and capital within the primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors.
Let's break down the vital formula for the aspirants because this is prime territory for prelims. The equation is GDP equals GVA plus net indirect taxes.
And net indirect taxes means taxes minus subsidies.
So if you are writing an analysis on the structural health of the manufacturing sector, you analyze the manufacturing GVA. Looking solely at manufacturing GDP might lead you to false conclusions based on fluctuating excise duties.
And it is crucial to remember a basic mathematical reality. Because India generally collects significantly more revenue through indirect taxes than it disperses through subsidies, the nominal numbers for GDP will almost always look higher than GVA.
Now, I need everyone listening to focus entirely because we are wading into Module 4, the most highly technical concept of this deep dive, the methodological revolution, double deflation.
This is a massive topic. Understanding double deflation is what elevates your knowledge from a casual observer to a serious economic analyst.
It explains why the new 2022-23 base year series is vastly superior. To appreciate the solution, we must first understand the flaw of the old system, single deflation.
Under the old methodology, when calculating real GDP or real GVA to remove the distorting effect of inflation, statisticians largely used single deflation.
Meaning they typically only adjusted the price of the final output for inflation.
Exactly. They observed the final product leaving the factory, calculated how much its price had inflated compared to the base year, and applied that single inflation metric to adjust the overall value-added numbers.
Let's build an analogy. Let's imagine a bakery.
Okay, the input is wheat, and the output is a cake.
Right. Now imagine a turbulent financial year. The global price of wheat actually falls by 5%. So the bakery's input cost experiences deflation.
But domestically, there is a massive surge in demand for cakes. So the retail price of the finished cake, the output surges by 20%.
Input costs drop, output prices skyrocket. This happens all the time in real manufacturing.
So how does the statistician operating under the old single deflation methodology handle this bakery?
They look at the bakery and say, I observe that the final price of cakes went up by 20%. I am going to apply a single inflation deflator based heavily on that output price.
And this is precisely where the statistical distortion occurs. By primarily looking at the inflation of the output and failing to account for the fact that input costs actually fell, single deflation massively warps the reality.
Because the final price shot up while the input cost dropped, the bakery's nominal profit margin explodes.
And under single deflation, that massive nominal profit is incorrectly attributed as real physical production. It makes it look like the bakery is boning, churning out thousands of more cakes.
When really it's just price distortion. They just capitalized on a favorable pricing arbitrage, cheap wheat, and expensive cakes.
It creates a phantom economic boom on paper.
Which highlights why the transition to double deflation is a statistical revolution. Under double deflation, the inflation of the inputs, the wheat, and the inflation of the outputs, the cake, are stripped away entirely independently.
The statistician notes that wheat prices dropped by 5% and applies a specific deflator to the input cost. Then they analyze the output side independently, note cake prices rose by 20%, and apply a separate deflator to the output revenue.
By doing this independently, you squeeze out all the pricing noise. What you are left with is a highly precise figure representing the actual tangible effort the bakery put into baking.
But executing double deflation across an economy as vast as India's requires an astronomical amount of granular data.
Which explains the expanded indicators. Under the old methodology, the government relied on roughly 180 product indicators to calculate these deflators.
It was a broad brush approach.
But under the new 2022-23 methodology, that statistical basket is expanding dramatically to encompass around 600 specific data indicators.
Moving from 180 to 600 is a quantum leap in accuracy. They can track specific inflation of industrial-grade cement independently from reinforced steel, independently from labor.
That level of detail leads to a massive leap in data accuracy. Okay, let's pivot to Module 5. Fixing the discrepancies through the integration of supply use tables, or SUT.
Ah, the infamous discrepancy line item. A major statistical headache.
Let's outline why this discrepancy exists. Theoretically, calculating GDP via the production method should yield the exact same number as calculating it via the expenditure method.
It's an immutable law of accounting. Every rupee of value produced must be consumed, invested, or exported. Aggregate supply must equal aggregate use.
But in the messy reality of the Indian economy, they never match. You have data lags, massive informal sectors, tax avoidance.
So when MoSPI tallies up the production side and then the expenditure side, the two numbers don't match. To balance the books, statisticians insert a discrepancy line item on the expenditure side.
Which creates massive doubt among policymakers. Are we overestimating production or underestimating consumption?
Enter the SUT solution. The new series integrates supply use tables.
Let's break down what an SUT is.
A supply use table is an exhaustive, multi-dimensional accounting matrix. It tracks exactly where inputs come from. Are they domestic or imported?
And it tracks exactly where outputs go, domestic consumption, intermediate use, or export.
By cross-referencing supply and consumption so intimately at the individual commodity level, you naturally shrink the gap between the production and expenditure approaches.
You are actively solving the accounting mismatches product by product. This drastically reduces that dreaded discrepancy line item and massively boosts the credibility of the data.
Moving on to Module 6, illuminating the shadows, the informal sector, gig economy, and GST.
This is huge. The inability to accurately measure the informal sector was a glaring vulnerability of the old methodology.
The core issue was the reliance on outdated proxies.
Let's illustrate this proxy problem. Under the old framework, executing real-time surveys for millions of street vendors was deemed impossible, so they calculated a ratio.
Say, for every euro produced by formal corporations, the informal sector produced 100. A 2.1 ratio.
The fatal flaw was locking that 2.1 proxy ratio in and applying it mechanically year after year. If the formal sector grew, they just assumed the informal sector grew at the exact same pace.
Completely ignoring ground reality during asymmetric shocks like demonetization.
Exactly. If demonetization crushed the cash-based informal sector while the formal sector survived, the old proxy ratio would falsely extrapolate that the informal sector was still healthy.
Recognizing this failure, the new methodology abandons static proxies and uses actual ground surveys.
Crucial acronyms for the aspirants to spell out: ASUSE and PLFS.
ASUSE stands for the Annual Survey of Unincorporated Sector Enterprises. It collects verifiable financial data directly from MSMEs and unregistered units.
And PLFS is the Periodic Labor Force Survey. It tracks employment dynamics across both rural and urban demographics.
By using ASUSE and PLFS, the government will finally capture the reality of the informal workers.
And this is exceptionally crucial for capturing the gig economy. In 2011, there were no massive fleets of ride-sharing drivers or food delivery riders.
The old proxy methods simply couldn't comprehend this new class of worker. The new methodology is designed to accurately weigh the gig economy.
We also have to discuss the GST data goldmine. GST was implemented in 2017, long after the last base year change.
The old methodology was structurally incapable of fully utilizing GST data, but now it's being fully integrated.
Along with MCA 21 data from the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. This allows statisticians to calculate highly accurate quarterly accounts and track regional corporate production in real time.
It replaces macro-level guesswork with hard, digitized facts.
Absolutely. Now let's bring it down to the consumption reality check in Module 7, the IIP and CPI revisions.
We'll briefly cover the Index of Industrial Production, the IIP. Its base is moving to 2022-23 to better track short-term output in mining, manufacturing, and electricity.
And crucially, it captures the rise of new industries like renewables, which barely existed a decade ago.
But the bigger story here is the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, which measures retail inflation.
Aspirants, take note of this crucial distinction. While the GDP and IIP base years are moving to 2022-23, the CPI base year is moving to 2023-24.
Do not get those confused on the exam. The CPI base is 2023-24.
And the CPI basket is getting a massive overhaul. It's expanding from 299 to 358 items.
This basket is meant to reflect the monthly consumption pattern of an average Indian household. The new additions are fascinating.
They really reflect new India. The statisticians are now tracking OTT platforms like Netflix and Prime,
Airline tickets, e-commerce expenses, and even rural house rent.
acknowledging that rural housing is moving towards structured rental markets. But the most profound structural shift in the CPI basket is the food weightage.
Urban food weight drops from 43% to 39.7%, and rural food drops from 53% to 47%.
Now, if I'm a student looking at rising tomato prices, I might wonder why the government is reducing the importance of food in the inflation calculation.
It actually aligns with established economic theory, specifically Engel's law. As aggregate per capita income rises, a smaller percentage of the household budget goes to basic food.
Let's do the math on that. If you earn $10,000 a month and spend $5,000 on food, that's 50% of your budget. But if your income rises to $50,000, you might spend $8,000 on food. The absolute spend increased, but the percentage dropped to 16%.
And that freed up income goes to services, healthcare, transport, entertainment.
So reducing the food weight and increasing the services weight makes the CPI a vastly more accurate reflection of an upwardly mobile society.
And why does CPI matter so much? Because the RBI uses CPI combined for its rigid 4% inflation targeting.
If the CPI basket is wrong, the RBI's interest rate decisions will be wrong. They might hike rates based on a temporary spike in food prices because the food weight was artificially high.
Which chokes off corporate investment. It is vital to get this right. And remember, there are other CPIs too, like for industrial workers, agricultural laborers, and rural laborers.
We have covered an immense amount of ground. Let's wrap this up with the big picture outcomes. When this data officially drops in February 2026, what happens?
The statistical authorities will engage in splicing. They will create a back series, recalculating historical data to align with the new 2022-23 base year framework.
This means India's total GDP size might change on paper. By capturing the gig economy and using double deflation, the absolute denominator, the total GDP, will likely shift.
And if the GDP changes, critical ratios automatically alter.
The fiscal deficit to GDP and debt to GDP percentages will change without a single policy shift. This boosts global investor confidence and helps target welfare schemes accurately.
It represents a massive leap in institutional maturity.
To leave our listeners with a final provocative thought, if changing the base year fundamentally rewrites our economic history on paper, how much of our perceived growth or slowdown over the past decade was just a mirage created by outdated statistics?
It really makes you question the narrative.
And looking ahead, as AI and digital goods become infinitely replicable at near zero marginal cost, will even the 2022-23 base year become outdated faster than ever before? How do you measure value in a post-scarcity digital economy?
That is the kind of forward-looking analysis an administrator needs.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Swadharma IAS Academy. Keep studying hard.